Hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Roney, your instructor for this course in strategic management. In this video, we're going to talk about gathering evidence to make strategic decisions. There's quite a lot of information to share with you about gathering evidence for strategic decisions. And so we're going to divide this video into two parts. So in fact, there are two videos on gathering the evidence. One part is about economic and market analysis, gathering evidence about the economy and markets that will influence your firm's performance potential, and gather and provide information that will be necessary to select from alternative objectives and strategies. The second video, the second part of this series, will be addressed to assessment of industry structure and analyzing industries, as well as firms' capabilities, their resources and skills. As well as some techniques for putting together assessment of the external environment, economy, market, and industry, to rationalize the external environment to internal capabilities, essentially to put the two parts of evidence together, evidence about the external environment and the internal capabilities. So with that, I just want to welcome you to the course and to this rather long video. My suggestion to you is potentially, because each of these videos is rather long, not necessarily to look at them in their entirety, but if one of them lasts for an hour and a half or 2 hours, I don't know how long they'll go. Don't hesitate to pause, to stop the recording and take a break, and then come back later when you're fresh, so that you can get the most out of these recordings. They're extremely important in this course. Unfortunately, most strategic management courses and textbooks don't do an adequate job of explaining how evidence needs to be gathered to make strategic decisions. They tend to focus on industry structure, but not necessarily on economic analysis or market analysis, and yet shifts in the economy and markets can certainly have an impact on firms' performance potentials and selections from goals and strategies. So we need to pay adequate attention to those things. So I guess with that introduction, what I'll do is just bring up the PowerPoint slides and we can get going. So hold on just a minute and let me do that. All right, so here we are. Let me just make sure for a moment that we're recording adequately here. I'm sorry, that'll just take a minute, but every once in a while we get surprised by the lack of recording. Well, I believe we are recording, so I'll just keep going. Okay, so we're going to talk about gathering evidence in these areas. They divide into two broad categories, of course: the external environment, made up of the economy, market, and industry, and the internal, the firm's internal capabilities, its resources and its skills, as well as financial analysis. In the middle is something called critical success factors. When we're talking about the industry, you'll see as we move into that part of the course and the end of this particular video, that in each industry there are certain functional capabilities of firms that separate winners from losers. It could be research and development, it could be engineering, it could simply be the efficiency of manufacturing, it could be marketing capability. There are any number of capabilities, functional capabilities, that characterize winners from losers. And if we can understand what those are, then it gives us a priority, a set of priorities to assess internal capabilities. We don't want to neglect any important capability, but we want to place particular priority on those functional capabilities that tend to separate winners from losers, to make the most difference in competition. And so that part of the industry analysis can be very revealing and certainly very important. And finally, at the end of the second video in this series, we'll talk about some schemes, some techniques to bring together these two parts of the analysis, the external analysis, internal capabilities. How do we bring them together so that they fit together in order to make a good strategy? And there are some techniques to rationalize the external environment, the way we see it shaping up, and what our capabilities are, and to match them so that they make a good fit. When we have a good fit, chances are we'll have a good strategy. So let's get started. This is an exhibit that appeared in a book that I wrote back in 1999, and it simply shows the scope of the external environment. Unfortunately, it leaves off the labels for the horizontal and vertical columns, and I need to acquaint you with those now. The horizontal columns, economies, industries, and markets, are the substance of the external environment, and so we call that the substantive dimension. The substantive dimension, S-U-B-S-T-A-N-T-I-V-E. And I'm sorry that that row is not labeled, because frankly there are a couple of quiz questions about it. But those are the three parts of the substantive dimension of the environmental assessment. Now there's another dimension, and they're characterized by the rows. So you can see that there are three rows, just like three columns. And the three rows represent the chronological dimension of external analysis. So the top row refers to trends from the past to the present. And it's very important to identify trends in economy, industry, or market variables that can influence your firm's performance potential, because those firms, unless something changes, those trends are likely to continue. Now, eventually, they'll also probably change due to shifts in the external environment. Could be technology or new competitors coming into the industry. Any number of things can happen. But until big changes happen, those trends, lacking any better information, are likely to continue. So we want to identify them and understand them. The second chronological dimension we call the forecast, or forecasting. And really it's our best guess as to what the future of the substantive dimensions, economic variables, industry variables, and market variables will be insofar as their influence on our firm's performance potential is concerned. So the forecast is our best guess, and in strategic planning, we do a lot of forecasting. There's a little problem there, though, isn't there? And that is, the longer the range of our forecast, the greater the likelihood that we'll be wrong. As we move further out into the future, more things can happen that we just don't anticipate, or at least they're not in our forecast. Once again, it could be technology, it could be regulation, it could be the arrival of new competitors, it could be the growing importance of new markets. But there just are lots of ways that a long-range forecast can be proven wrong. And yet, it's very difficult to shift strategy and to arrange resources that are necessary to respond to changes in the external environment. And so what we do today that distinguishes strategic planning from the past is we prepare forecasts of alternative futures using a variety of techniques, the most popular of which is to form scenarios, virtually stories about what the future would look like if some major change occurred. And I might add that this is a very well-established technique in military circles. You hear about it all the time. There's a desk in the Pentagon somewhere where somebody's responsible for assessing the contingency that Iran begins to launch missiles into Israel. That's a real possibility, and the military has to be prepared for it. And as you could imagine, there are lots of other alternative futures or contingencies that the military has to be prepared. And in business, we've learned about contingency planning from the military and found out that it's a pretty good idea to do it in business as well as the military. And we've developed techniques that are most appropriate in business and maybe not quite as useful in the military. But by and large, we simply have adopted this very useful technique that was developed by the military rather than by business planners. And it's a very powerful device. We contemplate what alternative futures in our industry, our market, or the economy might be, and then we monitor them over time. What will probably happen is that many of those scenarios will not come to pass, and we will realize that they're so unlikely that we'll quit monitoring them. But every once in a while, one of these alternative futures will look like it's becoming more likely. And as time passes, we flesh out that scenario. We develop more and more detailed strategic responses. And at some point, one of those alternative futures may become more likely than the forecast that we've been working on. And with that, when that happens, we flesh out the strategy for responding to that set of external environments. We switch out the old forecast, put in the new forecast, and switch out the old strategies and implementation programs that are indicated by this change in our outlook. And in a very deliberate, cool-headed, rational way, we change the plan so that it is most consistent with what seems to be most likely to occur out there in the economy, market, and industry. This is called contingency planning, and near the end of this course in strategic management, if you're taking it with me anyway, we will get into more detail about contingency planning. It's sort of the state of our art in strategic planning. By the way, if you take a look at this chart, a couple of other little facts for you. First of all, what is in the center of the chart, the white portion, those are indicators of the kind of variables that one would look for in each of these combinations of chronological and substantive dimensions, but you aren't responsible for those in this course. What you are responsible for is the names of those two dimensions, the substantive and chronological. If you want to have a better understanding of their definitions, you can look at the far right column and the very bottom row. The far right column will give you the definitions of the rows, and the bottom row will give you the definitions of the substantive dimensions in the columns. So a lot of information in this exhibit. This is an exhibit that was prepared by some of my students who at the time were studying Home Depot, Walmart, McDonald's, and Deere. These will simply give you some illustrations of the kind of variables that can be collected for specific companies when they're looking at economy, market, and industry variables. So these are just illustrations, nothing more than that. So now we'll move on to the next. My telephone is ringing. I'm just going to let it ring, and it will eventually stop ringing. So we'll start talking about the economy now. And here's a slide that is extremely important. And it contains economic trends and forecasts for countries or groups of countries. And it's done using something called purchasing power parity. Many of the economic forecasts and trends that you see in print are constructed by taking the value of a country's economy expressed in its own currency and then translated into dollars using bank exchange rates. And when you see those forecasts, they can be very misleading. Why? Well, let's take China as an example. China has grown rapidly until recently, when it's changed its method of economic planning or its strategy for economic growth by focusing on manufacturing of products that can be exported. And in order to facilitate or encourage exports, China's central bank and its government have kept the exchange rate for the yuan, the Chinese currency, at a low rate. So long story short, $1 can buy a lot of yuan. Even though the yuan in China is worth more than that. To give you an example, I was in China last summer, and at that time, the exchange rate was 6.5 yuan to the dollar. Now, let's say that a cup of coffee in the United States at that time cost $1. Now, I know a cup of coffee can cost you more or less depending on where you are and what kind of restaurant or whether you make it yourself and so forth. So we're just talking averages here, and we're going to pretend that the price of a cup of coffee in the US is $1. So if the exchange rate is 6.5 yuan to the dollar, when I was in China, I should have been able to buy a cup of coffee for 6.5 yuan, right? But it didn't cost me that much. It cost me 4.5 yuan. All right. So what's going on here? If a dollar only purchased 4.5 yuan, then it would be much more costly for American firms and consumers to buy products from China. And so the Chinese government required its central bank to make the exchange rate 6.5 yuan, meaning you can buy more yuan's worth of goods and services from China than it would cost you using domestic currency. You can get more than $1's worth of products by purchasing products from China rather than trying to get them domestically. And so what we're talking about is a difference in purchasing power between the bank exchange rate and the true economic value of the goods being purchased. And for that reason, economists now convert the value of economies, economic variables, into purchasing power using a technique called purchasing power parity. That's the right way to compare the value of different countries' economies. When we do that, here's the result that we get, and you can see it on this chart. The most striking thing in this chart that you should notice is that China's economy, the red line, has grown very rapidly, especially in recent years. And in fact, it crossed the black line, which is the US economy, at the end of 2013. And it surpassed the European Union, which consists of 28 countries, at least until England withdraws. You've heard about Brexit. It won't be long before Britain is not part of the European Union. But when this chart was done, England was still in the European Union. So the blue line is the combination of all 28 economies, all 28 countries' economies. You can see that China's economy grew larger than the European Union in 2015. The dotted line on the right represents today, when this recording was made around the beginning of 2018. And what you can see is that China's economy is growing faster than the US economy and Europe's economy. And as a result, there's no surprise that the gap between China's economy and those other two is widening. China's is a developing economy, whereas the United States and Europe's economies are developed. They're more mature, so it's reasonable that they don't grow as fast. But if you're in a multinational corporation and you're doing strategic planning, there's a message here, isn't there? That message is that especially if you're in consumer products and lots of durable goods industries, if you're not doing business in China, you may not be in the major leagues. China is the growth industry, is the growth market, rather. So there's another line on this chart. You can see it's the yellow line at the bottom of the chart, and it represents the 5 largest countries in the ASEAN group, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It includes Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Korea, I believe. Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Korea. Yeah. So the ASEAN nations are growing very rapidly, and as you can see, they've started to turn up, and we expect that the ASEAN group, the Southeast Asian economies, will be the next really rapid market. So again, if you're doing strategic planning, especially long-range planning, then you want to pay attention to the Southeast Asian markets. Now, looking at the US market, which is what we'll do here for a while, you can see these pie charts telling us a little bit about how the US economy is structured and some of the recent changes. Way back in 1959, just before the 1960s started, the consumer sector represented 62% of the US gross domestic product when we're talking about purchases. So consumer spending was a big part of the economy. The government represented almost a quarter, 22%. But as we take a look at the pie charts, pardon me, going forward, what we see is that at just about the turn of the century, 1997, consumer spending represented 2/3 of the GDP, and just about the same in 2013. Today, it's probably closer to 70%. So if you haven't heard already that the U.S. economy is driven by consumer spending, and I imagine you have, these pie charts demonstrate why that is said. Now, a funny thing has been happening with government spending. You can see it starts out at 22%, moves to 18%, and then 17%. Since then, it's come up. Government spending has increased a bit, and today it's probably closer to 20% again. So it's a significant part of the GDP. Government spending, again, represents about 20%. Not like consumer spending, but still nothing to be disregarded. And many companies do business with the government as a customer, and it is a big customer, and it has some pretty severe demands. Now, the gray section of this chart, or these charts, represents investment in structures and capital spending other than residential, other than homes. And you can see that it stayed pretty much in the same category. It moves from 10% in '59 to 12% in 2013. So it's another important sector, but not as large as those other two. And then the yellow represents residential expenditures. And you can see that as population growth slowed down, and for other reasons that we'll get into in these videos, the proportion of contribution to the US GDP that has been contributed by residential construction has declined. This is relevant, obviously, to contractors, manufacturers of components that go into buildings, utilities. There are a lot of these economic trends have a lot of impact on firms' performance potentials. And I need to emphasize this frequently during this video. This isn't a course on economics. It's not a course on marketing and so forth. But these variables and these sectors of the external environment have a great deal to say about the performance potential of your industry. And so if you're a strategic planner, you've got to gather evidence about these variables before you can really understand the performance potential of your industry and your company. So here's a little more detailed information about the US economy. The upper left-hand quadrant, you can see, represents rates of change in the gross domestic product after there's been an adjustment for inflation. And that's when that adjustment is made, we call it the real GDP. And you can see that there are sharp declines when we have recessions. Each of the sharp declines that you see on that chart occurred during a recession. As a matter of fact, that's the definition of a recession. But we also have periods of rapid growth. So our economy is cyclical, and although that doesn't look like it's a very smooth cycle, there is cyclicality in that chart. If we take a look at the upper right-hand chart, we see that the economy has grown faster than the population. If we simply take the value of the GDP and divide it by the population of the US, we get those numbers. You can see in that last recession in 2008 and 9, that GDP per capita dropped, and you can see that it's the sharpest drop. There was another little one back there in 2000, but this last one we went through really took down GDP per capita because a whole lot of the capita wasn't employed any longer. And so you can see where it happened. Inflation has been under control for several years. You can see the lower left-hand chart where it looks like inflation has been kept under pretty good control especially in recent years. You can see the dotted line sort of pointing down slightly, indicating that inflation and the rise of prices hasn't been a major problem for recent years. There's a lot of conjecture recently that prices are about to start up because the U.S. GDP seems to be likely to grow faster as a result of legislation that has been passed recently by the U.S. Congress. And finally, on the lower right-hand chart, you see the gross national saving. It's a very important variable, but it doesn't get much recognition. Yet you can see that it's got some pretty sharp increases and decreases. The gross national saving is the sum of corporate profits plus individuals, persons' savings. So what's profit? Profit is a company's revenue, right? Less its cost. The difference after income taxes are paid is retained as retained earnings. And for you and me, we call it our wages or salary as income, and then we have expenses. And after we've spent money for our expenses, what's left over is our savings. So it's the same for corporations as people, but we usually don't think of it that way, even though both of the end results are savings. And those savings combined represent the capital that is available to redeploy to increase the capital structure of the nation, at least a large portion of it. And you can see that it's quite cyclical. Back there during that last recession, boy, it came down dropped like a stone, didn't it? On the other hand, during the 90s, when the economy was really booming, you can see that there was more national saving or capital available for redeployment. And in recent years, we've had another little dip, but it looks like things are starting to pick up again. And so depending on how we look at that chart and what we think the future holds for the next couple of years, which is represented in that chart, you might tend to think that the outlook for capital spending is fairly good. Incidentally, something that I did not point out that I probably should is in the upper left-hand chart again, the rate of growth of the gross domestic product. And what you can see is that there's a dotted line running through it. Theoretically, the space above and below the line is about the same on that graph. And if that dotted line is telling us the truth, then it would appear that there's sort of a declining trend, long-term declining trend in the rate of the U.S. economy's growth. Now, once again, that should not be surprising because the U.S. economy is highly developed and mature. And mature economies don't grow as fast as those that are still developing. So not a big surprise there, but something to bear in mind anyway. Among other things, what does it say to you if you're a multinational enterprise? Your growth markets are probably outside the U.S., where nations are developing more. So that, again, has relevance for strategic planning. Okay, here's a little more detail about the U.S. economy, and we start with a benchmark, the U.S. population. You can see that during the time in this chart, that is for 20 years anyway, I think it's from 1980 to 2000, the population grew some by 49 million people, or 17%. By 2020, we'll have about 330 million people in this country. In 2016, it was 323. Today, it's probably about 325 million. Now, if we look over to the right, on the right-hand side at the top, we see how fast employment has been growing. And so, again, 1980 to 2000, the 37.6 million of those 49.2 million people that were added to the population, 37.6 more people were employed during that same space of time. And that was an increase of almost 38%, much faster than the population. That's good. On the other hand, in the most recent 20 years, or 18 years anyway, the employment has gone up 18 million. And if we want to compare apples to apples, we ought to do it for 20 years. So perhaps for this current 10-year period, maybe it'll go up 20 million. And the increase be maybe 13%. And if we simply compare the growth rate in the current decade or 2 decades to the last 2 decades, we can see that the rate of growth in employment has slowed down. And that's an important point. Once again, you can see how sharply employment dipped during that last major recession. If we look to the chart on the left at the bottom, we see the proportion of the total population that is employed. And so quite simply, we take the number of employed people and divide it by the total population. And here's the result. You can see that most recently, about 47% of the US population was employed. So among those that are not employed are kids, babies and students and, high school students and even college students, people who are on disability leave, and of course, that growing portion of people who have retired and are no longer working. And so less than half of the total population is employed. And you can see that that number really drops during economic downturns. Now, later on, we'll see another version of this chart. Another item we'd like to look at is what portion of the people who are eligible to be employed is employed. But right now, we can simply appreciate that less than half of the people in this country have to generate taxes, pay taxes to the government, and contribute to Social Security and welfare programs in the process of doing so to support the other half, frankly, more than half. Over time, it's unlikely that that this number is going to get much higher. As a matter of fact, it'll probably get lower. And this represents a real problem for the US economy. How does that small a portion of people pay for a growing population in terms of welfare and other entitlements and Social Security and so forth? It's a problem. The lower right-hand chart shows the trends in the unemployment rate. And here again, you can see just how cyclical the unemployment rate is. However, look out, there's a problem with this ratio. The unemployment rate is calculated by dividing the number of people who apply for unemployment insurance. It used to be that they showed up at the unemployment window, but the local government office. Today, a lot of it's done by mail, but these are the folks who have applied for and are receiving some kind of unemployment compensation. So that number is divided by the total workforce, that is the total people who are employed, plus that number who have applied for and are receiving unemployment compensation. Something's left out, isn't there? What's left out are the people who are no longer applying for unemployment compensation, perhaps because their unemployment compensation have run out. Or maybe after this last dip, when technology changed drastically, before the big recession, perhaps they had the skills to do a particular kind of job. But today that job doesn't exist because technology in the form of robots, conveyors, computerized manufacturing has eliminated the job, and those folks don't have the skills to go back to work. And for those and a lot of other reasons, there is a large portion, some 30 million as I recall, people who simply are not included in the unemployment rate compensation because they're not showing up for unemployment compensation because either they have simply given up, they have essentially stopped trying to find regular work, or their unemployment compensation has run out. Either way, the unemployment compensation, the unemployment rate statistic is misleading, and it's far too low. This chart, which is prepared by the Federal Reserve Bank at St. Louis, shows the labor participation rate. This is the portion of people who are eligible to go to work. They're in an age range of people who can go to work. I think it's 18 to 65, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Less the people who are in college, less the people who are have disability insurance. But this is the portion of people who are eligible to work. They're in the right age category, they're not in school, and they're not disabled, and who are working. And as you can see, that proportion today is less than 63%, and it has come down. And it's come down for some of those reasons that I explained a couple moments ago. But what this says is that some 37% of people who are eligible to work don't. They don't work. They may want to work, or they may not want to work. Either way, they're not working. Many of them are looking for unemployment compensation, but this is a big problem. And it's a big problem for lots of reasons that are relevant to corporate planning and that are also relevant to economic policy. You know, we would like to train these people, like to get them back into school. You know, there are many people who think that these people should receive some sort of subsidy even when they are not working because technology has eliminated their jobs. But whatever whatever judgment about this trend you may have, one thing's for sure, and that is that over a third of the eligible workforce isn't working, and that is a tremendous waste of human capital. And it means that if somebody can attack this problem, indeed, the U.S. economy does have some growth potential if we could get these people back to work. Okay, more on the U.S. Government and this on the U.S. economy, this time looking at the federal government's expenditures. And you can see that the top left-hand chart shows trends in the U.S. federal deficit. Notice the negative numbers on the y-axis. You will see in recent years that that number is plunging. That is to say that the deficit is rising. And you can see that it's headed toward $1 trillion. This is in billions of dollars, and 1,000 billion is a trillion. What this chart does not show is recent legislation that reduced taxes. And that's going to add another $1.5 billion to the deficit over, I think, 3 years. And yet another piece of legislation was just passed, which is going to increase expenditures for entitlement programs and defense. We need both of those. We need defense especially. But that's going to add another $1.2 trillion in 3 years. And there is currently proposed legislation to increase expenditures substantially for the U.S. infrastructure. And so when this chart is drawn again, the right side of that chart is going to come down dramatically, and it's going to exceed $1 trillion and then some. And this is a cause for concern, as this number, as the deficit, the difference between the government's revenues and expenditures, continues to increase. This is going to cause more borrowing, and it's probably going to push prices up. It's going to push interest rates up, that's for sure. And so there are consequences of this government borrowing, and those consequences will be felt at the very least by corporations in their interest rates. Now, you can see over on the right side at the top, the federal deficit as a proportion of the gross domestic product. And by the way, you can see in both of those charts what went on when we entered that Great Recession. And by the way, everybody talks about the Great Recession occurring in 2008 and 9, but you can see that things were happened pretty fast in 2008, and they lasted until perhaps 2012. So that was a very substantial, long-standing dip in or reduction in the cost that this government had to sustain by essentially borrowing money to make up for what it did not collect in taxes. Now, once again, notice that the upper right-hand chart sort of begins to angle downward in its projections through 2022. You can bet that when these charts are done again, that angle is going to be steeper. Now, supposing that you and your family spend more than your income, how are you going to make up the difference? You're going to borrow it, right? You're going to get a line of credit and borrow it. Now, if you have a deficit, that is, you spend more than your income every year, what's going to happen? Every year that you incur a deficit, that deficit is going to be added to your debt. And so over time, your debt is going to rise. And what you see in the lower left-hand chart is the total of the federal debt. And it is now something, we got to read the chart right, but in 2018, it's right around $20 trillion. And as you can see from the chart on the right, that's more than 100% of the gross domestic product. And by the way, these lines do not include debt incurred by state and local governments or the debt that is guaranteed by the federal government for such things as home loans. So when we add all the debt together, I'll show you some charts that have those numbers on them, but they're all understated because they don't include a lot of things like government guarantees. But we have an economy that is heavily indebted. So here are some of those government charts that I mentioned. I would show you that add the state and local spending. And what I'm going to try to do is not go into, I think there are 3 of these pages, and I'm going to try not to go into them in real detail. I'm going to let you look at them. Be sure to read the legends at the bottom. If we just look at the upper left-hand column, we see the trend in government spending. You can see that the red is federal, the green is state, the gray is local government. There's a little blue line at the bottom, and it goes negative. Why is that? Because the federal government allocates funds. It distributes tax monies to the states that then spend the money. So the government records an expenditure of funds to states, and then the states record expenditures in the same amount. They spend that money that the federal government gives them or gives them back. And so we have double counting here. And the line below zero offsets it offsets the double accounting so that the total is correct. And in any event, you can see that when we add all those things up in 2015, we're pushing 40% of the gross domestic product, about 20 for the federal and another 20 for state and local. Folks, that's a lot of spending. If you look at the upper right-hand chart, the yellow arrow points to where we are today. And you can see then that the Congressional Budget Office has given us some projections for Social Security, health care, interest expense on the debt, and other federal expenditures. And you can see that the projection is for substantial increases. And where are the increases the greatest? Read the chart, please. Healthcare and interest on the debt. And based on what I told you a few minutes ago about the consequences of this recent legislation, what can you expect? That when this outfit, and by the way, you can see there's down at the bottom of each chart, the organization that prepares these charts, the usgovernmentspending.com. You can go there, and these charts will be revised, and periodically it might be interesting for you to go update them just for your own information. But when they're revised, that gray wedge will be larger. And the reason, of course, is that federal debt will be larger. If we go to the lower left-hand chart, we'll see entitlement spending. And boy, what's it been doing? It's been rising. Pardon me, I'm going to adjust this camera just a little bit. There we go. We can see that the entitlement spending for pensions and healthcare and welfare have really shot up beginning in the 1960s. And based upon trends in legislation, they're going to continue to rise. Altogether, they represent between 15 and 20% of the GDP. Folks, that's a lot of money. And what category is rising most rapidly? It's healthcare, isn't it? It's healthcare. Medicare, Medicaid. This is and by the way, disability insurance from Social Security. So annual federal deficit. You can see that chart goes to 2016. If we add one to go to 2018, boy, would we see a spike in that one because of this new legislation. So here's the second chart, the upper left-hand corner, the deficit, the gross public deficit from all three segments of government. And oh boy, I mean, we're again, it ends in 2016, and in 2016, it was something like 23, gross public debt, $23 trillion, and that was in 2016. 2018, gonna be a lot more. So today we're probably at 25 trillion plus. The accumulated gross federal debt, just the federal debt as a proportion of the GDP, that is the value of the economy, over 100% in 2016, way over 100% today. Lower left-hand corner, gross public debt, all the debt as a percent of GDP, way over 100%. The green is federal, the red is local, the blue is state. And then interest on the debt, and we have a different story there in the lower right-hand corner. Interest on the debt, especially the federal debt, has come down in recent years. Why is that? Is the government just borrowing less? No, we know that from the other charts. Interest rates have come down, partly because of Federal Reserve policy. But we know that as the economy heats up, as the Federal Reserve changes its policy regarding what's called loose policy, buying low-quality debt in order to pump money into the economy. It's not doing that anymore, but it was doing that when the economy was weak. Now it's buying it back. It's reducing its investment in low-quality and any debt. So the Federal Reserve is no longer pumping funds into the economy. The U.S. government and state governments are borrowing more money, and the demand for funds is going up. And with a lesser or slower growth in money supply, we have a supply-demand imbalance, and we can expect that interest rates will go up as a result. And in fact, we already can see interest rates starting up. They have begun to go up during the past year. What does that mean? It means that that green section of the lower right-hand chart is going to start to rise again as the interest rates that the federal government has to pay on its rising debt go up. And so we can see interest expenses going up pretty sharply. If this chart went to 2018 instead of 2015 as it does, we would see that it's already come up. But when we forecast it into the future, it would come up faster. Okay, this one it shows the expenditures on the top two charts for what's called discretionary federal spending. There's two broad categories of federal spending. One is, the first segment is called mandated. Laws have been passed, legislation has been passed that mandates that the government spend money for healthcare, Social Security, welfare, and the like. Then there's another category of spending called discretionary. It's not discretionary, but it's not mandated. But it's called discretionary, and these are for things that are for expenditures that aren't mandated, and therefore they have to be authorized by acts of Congress, usually every year. And so if you've been paying attention to the news lately, you know that there's been a lot of debate in Congress about how much should be spent for defense. Defense spending is considered discretionary in federal terms, in federal budgeting. So is spending for education and a whole lot of other things, transportation. Although there's now legislation pending for federal spending for transportation and infrastructure, in which case it'll be mandated. So now we can look at these at the top two charts, and we see that they're discretionary. And with all the increases in this mandated spending, less is available for discretionary spending, right? And so we see that defense spending as a portion of the GDP, it's nothing like that 20% we saw, is it? We see that here as of 2015, it was maybe 5% of the GDP. And in today's troubled world, wise people, knowledgeable people say that even though we spend a lot on defense, we need to do a lot more. We live here in this part of the country near an Air Force base, and publications say that about half of our military aircraft are not flying because they need parts that they don't have. That's not good. There may be a lot of ways to make the military more efficient, but it looks like we need to spend more in order to have a viable defense and a viable military structure in this country. But if we're spending so much on these mandated expenses, less is available for defense. Now take a look at education over on the right side. Don't be fooled by the size of the wedges. That's a very misleading chart. It's accurate, but it's misleading. First of all, notice that it gets up to 6%. And if you look at the left-hand chart, 6% is way down near the bottom of the defense chart. But if you look further, what you will see is that the red is federal. That's federal money, usually doled out to the states, so the states can spend it on their universities. And you can see that that's not very much. The green is state spending. That's the state spending for, among other things, universities. We hear a lot about that here in the Raleigh and Charlotte areas. But the North Carolina is very sensitive to state spending for education. But you'll notice that that's just 2% of the GDP. The large wedge is for local spending. And that local spending is for grade schools and high schools, for the kind of education that we don't call higher education. It's to send our kids to school. And it is rising, but that's not doing anything for advanced education. And so, in fact, the chart in the upper right says that we've been pretty frugal when it comes to spending for education, especially at the federal level. And again, since education is discretionary and there are these other types of spending that are mandated, that makes it difficult to come up with money to support education. Now we go back down to the mandated categories in the bottom of this chart. And lo and behold, there's healthcare spending, and it's growing like a rocket, isn't it? The red is federal, the green is state, and there isn't much at the local level. The blue is to offset the double spending, the allocations of funds from the federal government to the states. We can see over on the right, Medicare, Part A, B, C, and D. And no surprise there, it's going up quite rapidly. And again, these two on the bottom are mandated. They are required by law. So the government, until it changes the laws, can't change the rate at which those expenditures grow. It's a real problem, isn't it? Here we have some, in the upper left-hand corner, forecasts. The yellow arrow points to where we are now. And if you just take a look at where we are now and compare it to 2030, what you can see is that we're in for some very rapid increases in Medicare spending over the next decade and further. And that's because why? I mean, it's a very logical thing. More people are retiring. They don't work and they need health care insurance, and the government provides it. If you were me, you wouldn't object to that, because when I'm retired, I'm not going to have the health insurance that Mount Olive provides me, University of Mount Olive provides me. I'm going to have to buy my own insurance, and one of my options will be to get it from Medicare, and I'll probably do that. And the government's going to help me with that. and your taxes are going to pay for it. This is another burden, a legislated burden on the federal budget. Over on the right, we see Social Security. Again, and I'm an old guy. There are lots more old people in the world today than there used to be, and that's true of our country. And you can see that the trend in Social Security payments has been gone up steeply. There was a little drop, and now we'll see some population charts pretty soon in this video, and you will see that the number of people retiring and older age is going to go up quite dramatically in the next decade or 2 decades. As a result, this chart is going to shoot up. And again, that's going to put another burden on the federal deficit, on the federal budget. State and local spending in the lower left-hand chart, same pretty much the same pattern. And the largest state programs over on the right, at the bottom, you can see healthcare is the blue, education is the red, pensions, there's some state pensions in there, and the green and the gray is welfare. So these are all mandated expenditures, and they are all rising. Now, what we've been looking at so far are long-term trends. Here's the current version of these things, and we can look at those very quickly, prepared by the same outfit, but I pulled these quite recently. So this is the current situation without these recent pieces of legislation. So total spending, and total spending, and it would be in 2017 would be the first red bar, and this year the second red bar. You can see we're over $4 trillion, as I mentioned earlier, and the projection is to be to see that pushing $5 trillion. Only we know something, don't we? We know that there are 2 pieces of legislation that have just passed and 1 pending. Each of them provides for spending over $1 trillion over a small number of years. The result, $5 trillion is already a done deal. That's a lot of money. $5 trillion is a portion of 20 trillion GDP. That's a quarter of our economy, a quarter of the value of our economy spent by government agencies. Healthcare accounts for a lot of that, and again, it's going to go up by virtue of education. We can see now that it's over $1 trillion, and by virtue of this new legislation, it's going to be a lot higher. It would have been anyway. You can see the forecast of 2022 is almost up to $1.5 trillion. You can forget that with this new legislation. It's already there. Welfare, rather interesting. It goes up and down with the economy, doesn't it? And in recent years, the economy's gotten better, so the government has had to spend less on unemployment insurance and other welfare programs. Nevertheless, we've just had a piece of legislation that increased it. So when this chart is done again, lo and behold, the red bars will go up. You can see that when we were in recession and getting over it there from 2008 to 2012, the bars really went up a lot. And finally, pensions. And of course, pensions are they're going to go up because there are more people who are living longer, and they need, among other things, money to live on from Social Security. Now we look at defense, and we can see that after 2010, defense spending actually went down. It's been about $800 billion. It's come up in the last couple of years because it's been a priority for the new administration, and we can see that it's projected to be flat, but that's before this new piece of legislation. So we might get to $1 trillion of annual defense spending. Again, although it's big money, it may not be such a bad thing. However, something's got to give. And if you look at the upper right-hand panel, what do you see? You see that spending after last year for education is headed down. It's hard to see that chart changing much. None of the new legislation has provided for education. And for those of us in the education industry, that's not necessarily good news. We've got more people to educate and less money to do it with. Unless we're charging higher tuition, right? Or unless students are going students are going to the bank to get larger student loans. We can see federal expenditures for transportation, not very much compared to the other budgets. Look at the y-axis again. You don't see really big numbers on the order of $80 billion. That's not a big number in the total scheme of things. Scheduled to go down. Legislation pending that will bring the bars up, but just how much we don't know yet because it's just pending legislation. But you can see that spending for transportation, airports, railroads, highways, has been pretty flat for the last decade, right? Or the current decade. From 2010 to 2020, we see here to be pretty flat. On the order of about $90 billion and projected to decline to 80 or under 80. Again, legislation is pending to raise that. But where do we see the big increases? Interest on the federal debt and on government debt, rather. And although it's rising rapidly in this chart, by virtue of the legislation that's already been passed and rising interest rates, you ain't seen nothing yet. That number is headed to much higher levels. Now I want to change the subject and just introduce to you a concept that may help you get some perspective when you're looking at multiple countries' economies. Let's start with the US economy first. And here we see a trend in categories of industries, so-called sectors, okay? We have the services sector, the goods producing sector, which is really the manufacturing sector, and the government sectors, and the proportions of the GDP represented by spending in those sectors. And what do we see? Over time, manufacturing dropped from about 37%, or call it 40, down in 2013 about maybe 22%. That's a big drop, isn't it? On the other hand, services. What are services? Healthcare, lawyers, insurance, education. No doubt about it. Services have been the growth sector from about 48% to maybe 68%. Yeah, probably 68, 67%. From about half to 3/4 of the economy. Services have been kind of where the action is. Government spending has come up a little bit, but it's sort of stayed in that plateau that we talked about earlier. It's come up recently to almost 20%. In this chart, I think it gets up to something like 17 or 18%. And we saw that in the pie charts earlier. Now, why am I showing this to you? First of all, it tells you that growth industries in the United States are more likely to be providing services than manufactured product. There's some optimism in the manufacturing industries today due to the more sophisticated technologies that we have. 3D printing, for instance, may make it possible to produce products without much labor at all. So even though labor costs are lower in other countries, if you can reduce the labor cost to zero by 3D printing, then it becomes a lot easier to produce the product here in this country, and you don't have to pay for the freight across the ocean. And computer-aided manufacturing, a whole lot of technology is enabling us to do manufacturing more economically and more efficiently. But so far, the trend you see is the trend we have. Services are more likely to be where the action is. Now, again, this chart is useful all by itself to those of us who are corporate planners. However, let's just imagine what this chart would look like 150 years ago here in the US. What would the top line's label be? It wouldn't be services. What would it be? Manufacturing. We would be going through the Industrial Revolution, and manufacturing would be the growth industry. What would the black line headed down be? Wouldn't be manufacturing. What would it be? Agriculture, right? Suddenly we've got more efficient means of producing food, costliness of producing agricultural product, be it grains or meat, would go down. And so we would see the agricultural sector declining and the manufacturing sector rising. Why is that interesting? Because there are countries around the world that are still developing. They're at the stage of development that this country was at 150 years ago. So if we understand that countries' economies go through this sectoral evolution, this gives us a little bit of insight or assumptions as we look at these developing nations and we ask, all right, is this nation growing in its manufacturing base? What about services? Services probably are growing, but they aren't growing at the rate they're going to grow in the distant future. Right now, we're probably ought to be looking for growth in the manufacturing sector of a developing nation, and that's exactly what happened in China. And now China's beginning to develop its service economy. So countries and economies go through sectoral evolution. And that's the point I'd like to make to you. All right, here's a little more detail of what we've just seen, just so we can appreciate the action in the individual industries. You can see the red line, can't you? Manufacturing has just plummeted from a high of about 27% down to, in 2013, something like 12%. I mean, it's cut in half, right? The light blue line on the bottom is agriculture. The dark blue line in the middle are those services: finance, insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing, sometimes called FIRE, F-I-R-E, finance, insurance, real estate, and E. And I can't remember the E. Anyway, you can see that those services have been increasing. And then starting around 1988, we have a new line, a new hound in the hunt. And that's the digital economy. Information, communication, technology, producing industries. And if we were to extend this line out past 2013, which is as far as this graph goes, what we would see is that the digital industries, the technology industries, are really growing rapidly, and manufacturing continues to decline. But I neglected the second rising line. It's the black line right above the little short one. And those are the professional and business services, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. And so if we were to look at the blue line that's rising and the black line that's rising, those are both services, aren't they? And so, yes, indeed, we're in a service economy. However, that digital economy is where the next spurt of growth surely is coming from. All right, now we're going to move to another topic, and that is prices and the rate of growth in prices. What do we see on this chart, which goes to 2014? The red line is rising faster than all the others. Let's look down at the legend. What does that red line represent? It's the price for medical care, health care, doctor bills, pharmaceuticals, hospital stays, medical insurance. And that line is the reason for all the public debate and all the political wrangling that's been going on over health insurance, because the cost of health insurance and health care has risen so rapidly in recent years. That's the reason that Obamacare passed. That's the reason that we're still, struggling to get political peace out of this thing. Now, in recent years, the increase in healthcare prices has come down because of legislation that affects reimbursements by Medicare, reimbursements for pharmaceuticals and the like, but it's still at a very high level. And now if we look at the black line on this chart, that's the rate of growth in disposable personal income, essentially your take-home pay. It's your income, your wages and salary, less the unemployment taxes. Your income taxes and your unemployment taxes. So it's take-home pay. And that line has been adjusted for inflation. But what you can see is that the prices of these non-discretionary goods and services, healthcare, food, shelter, transportation, those prices have risen faster than disposable income has risen. As a result, your and my discretionary spending power, what we have available to spend after we have made expenditures for goods and services that we cannot do without, the so-called non-discretionary expenditures for healthcare, shelter, food, transportation. After we've paid those, we have less in our budget for the things that we would like, such as vacations, a new car, new clothing, a nice dinner out on the weekend. So our discretionary spending power has been coming down, and that's because non-discretionary expenditures have gone up faster than our take-home pay. Most of you are relating to what I'm saying now. You know this is true. Here are some of the reasons why. You can see the prices of gasoline, food at home, electricity, and food away from home. Gasoline prices really were going up rapidly until the recession and the discovery of a new way of extracting oil from the ground using what's called fracking. I won't get into that now. That has pushed prices down. They came up for a while in recent years and then dropped back down again. Now they're rising again. Why is this important? If you're making cars, if you're manufacturing cars, and the price of gasoline is going up, there's greater demand for hybrids and electric cars, right? But that's not all. If you're making agricultural or construction machinery that runs on diesel fuel, again, if prices are up, your customers want engines in those machines that use fuel more efficiently. The same is true of aircraft manufacturers, right? When the price of jet fuel goes up, that becomes a very big burden on airlines' income statements, and they ask manufacturers to produce aircraft with more efficient engines. The food away from food at home, what do we call that? Groceries. Have your grocery prices been going up? Oh, yes, they have. How about the prices to heat your home and operate all those electrical gadgets in your house? Wow, look at that chart. And how about food away from home? Well, when you are employed, you go out for lunch, right? And that chart shows you what the trend has been in the prices that you're paying for lunch. Now we have healthcare prices. The upper left-hand chart is the average of all the healthcare prices, and you can see that they have been going up on average pretty steadily, even right through the recession, because a lot of those prices are charged by hospitals and when you're and doctors and drug manufacturers, and when you're sick, you just got to have those services or those products. Pharmaceutical prices has come down partly because of the greater proportion of generic drugs that are available, partly because of some legislation, partly because of the guidelines from Medicare that say that they won't pay as much for some pharmaceuticals as they have in the past. Health services, on the other hand, hospitals and doctors, they're continuing to rise, just like that average chart at the top. And medical equipment, again, subject to reimbursement rules by Medicare, and they have come down now. They've started to rise again. But we're becoming more efficient in manufacturing this equipment. And so the good news has been in the products, drugs, and equipment. The bad news has been in the cost of services, hospitals and doctors. I'll leave it to you to figure that one out. Now, here's what's been going on with our take-home pay, disposable personal income. The top chart shows what has been happening to personal income before we adjust it for inflation. And as you can see, during the 1990s, it was going up. There's a surprise to come from that it was going up, but I'll tell you right now, part of the reason was that cost of living was going up, inflation rates were higher. You can see that in more recent years, the rate of increase in take-home pay has been coming down, and in recent years, down even more. When we look at the lower chart, we take the rate of inflation of the consumer price increase out of the rates of increase at the top, and we see a much narrower range of increases, and there is a definite trend downward in our real take-home pay, which is why these increases in prices of goods and services that we can't do without are causing us more difficulty as consumers. Now, again, does this have ramifications for business planners and corporate planners? Oh boy, you know, what's one of the most successful companies on the stock market today? It's one you don't hear about, but you see every day. It's called Dollar General, right? And then there's the what is it called? I can't think of it now. Dollar Tree. That's it. Dollar Tree. And of course, Walmart, right? So if you're PepsiCo, if you're a manufacturer of food product, if you're a manufacturer of clothing, if you're a retailer, you need to understand that there is a general desire among the consuming public to get a better deal, to buy things at a lower price, because the costs of things you can't afford to do without, that you can't do without, are rising, and therefore you have less of the things that are discretionary that you want to buy. You have less money to buy them with, and therefore you looking for deals. You're looking for value offers. And we'll get into more about value offers later in the second part of this series on evidence gathering. But these two charts sort of finish our exploration of discretionary spending power. Now, here's a chart prepared by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis that shows what has been happening to the saving rate, personal saving. What portion of disposable personal income, that is our take-home pay, are we not spending? And you can see that that portion has declined for several years. And economists debate why that is. The general explanation you will hear is that the economy was doing so well that people being employed and being optimistic didn't feel that they needed to save as much as they did in the past. They were more optimistic. Frankly, I think there's another answer. I think we've already seen it. The price of non-discretionary items went up. And frankly, the price of discretionary items also went up. The price of cars, for instance. Americans generally are sort of spoiled. They're indulgent. And although they see they have less in their budget for discretionary items, they choose not to do without what they have become accustomed to. So they buy those things, even if they can't afford them, and even though their budget doesn't provide for them. How do they do that? They do it by borrowing. We'll get to that later. So I think the saving rate is declining because people choose not to do without what they have become accustomed to, which is a good lifestyle. Now, you can see that the saving rate rose during the recession and eventually really peaked, even during the recovery. Now, some economists will tell us, you see, the American public has wised up. They now know that they have to save more. And in response to that, some of us say, balderdash. It's not true. What happened is the banks cut us off. So what's happening is that foreclosures occurred on mortgages and other term debt. When you couldn't pay it, if you borrowed a car, if you bought a car, borrowed a house, it was retrieved. It was taken back by the borrower. When there used to be two wage earners in a family, but during the recession there was only one, and maybe none, but perhaps one. All right, so in that circumstance, the bank, when you couldn't make your credit card payments, it cut your limit. And so although even in a recovery, when you were earning more money, you had this credit card debt or this term loan debt that you had to pay back. You could not spend. And so the calculation of the saving rate is an unspending rate, and you weren't spending, you were paying back your loans, all right? And as a result, the saving rate, the unspending rate went up. You were not, you weren't taking on more debt. You were paying down the debt that you already had. Now we see near the right side of this chart, which is a very recent chart, and it goes into 2018. You can see the saving rate has started to dip down again. Why is the saving rate dipping down again? Because people now are being employed. They are, again, more optimistic. And now that they have the money coming in, they're spending it because they don't want to do without what they have become accustomed to. Instead of saving it, we're spending it. So here's the consequence: rising consumer debt. You can see that consumer debt came down during the recession, and the decline went past the recession, which is consistent with what I just told you a minute ago. So we were repaying debt back then. Now consumer debt is up and away, and it will be, by the end of this year, it'll be at $4 trillion. That's a lot of money, folks. That's 20% of the GDP. That's a lot of money. And it didn't used to be anything nearly as large as that, did it? Here are some of the sources of consumer debt. And this should fascinate you. The blue line at the top, the one that's rising the fastest, if you are a student in my course watching this video, you're the reason why that line is going up. At least you may be. That's student loans. Student loans, if you want to take a look at the orange line, which is sort of goes flat, dips, and it's down and ends up in the middle of this chart. And this one only goes to 2015, by the way. But it's far below student loans. And the red line is car loans. Student loans are even more than the amount that we borrow to buy cars. These trends have continued. Student loans in this chart end up at about $1.25 trillion. The amount for car loans was about $1 trillion. And the credit card debt was something on the order of $720 billion. So these trends have continued. And again, there are real questions as to just whether this chart makes sense or not, but these are the facts. Another way to look at the debt problem is median family income. And this chart, again, prepared by the Federal Reserve Bank at St. Louis, shows that median family income today, after adjusting for inflation, is about $59,000. Now, the inflation adjustment in this case, I believe, is 2000. I wish it would tell us here because 2016. So the inflation adjustment is really meant to adjust the numbers on the left side of this chart so that they're more comparable to the current. So essentially, the number on the right, $59,000, is pretty much, because inflation is so low, is pretty much the median family income in the United States today. Oh, as a matter of fact, pardon me, this one goes all the way to 2017. It is the median family income today. First of all, we get some real information from this chart. We can see that in that most recent recession, even after the recession was over, it took a long time for people to find work and get back to work. As a matter of fact, it's only been in the last year that we've surpassed where we were all the way back in 2000. So it's taken an awfully long time to recover from that recession. And that's another reason why the banks and lenders have had to put limits on our borrowing capacity. And that is that's why that's why the saving rate looked like it was going up. It was because instead of borrowing more, we were repaying debt more. We weren't purchasing more, even though it looked like we were saving more. That we were just repaying. And so now we see a median family income of $59,000. The median is that point above or below which 50%, half of the population resides. So half of the families in the United States were making more than $59,000, half less. Now, $59,000, somebody might say, is a good income, but really, think about it. Most families have 2 wage earners. So we take $59,000 and we divide it in half. And what do we have? $29,500. One member of the family earns a little more than the other, so 30 and 29, you know, you pick a number, a pair of numbers. But, and then there are even some families where more than one member of the family works. Have you heard of latchkey kids? Both adults are out at work. The kids come home, if they're teenagers, and they may make dinner. But if there's more than one kid and the kid is 18 years old or 17 years old, they may go to work. Some families have more than 2 wage earners. Long story short, even though the median family income may be almost $60,000, what it takes to get to that level is a lot of sacrificing by the members of that family, which gives them less time to enjoy those things that they want to buy with their discretionary income. Another thing that's been favorable in the economy is the trend of interest rates. Here you can see the trend in 15 and 30-year mortgage rates. Now, mortgage rates have started up recently, but still, mortgage rates have made it possible for people to buy homes. That's been a good thing. As interest rates begin to move back up due to federal borrowing, it is highly likely that we will see mortgage rates not getting back up to where they were when they were 18%. That was awful. I remember that very well. But it wouldn't be at all out of reason for to see mortgage rates going up to 6%. That wouldn't be difficult to expect at all. But that would make it more costly for people to make mortgage payments and therefore to buy a home. Here is the same trend in interest rates, but this is in the rates for high quality corporate bonds, AA bonds. And as you can see, interest rates are low today, and they've come down in recent years, which has made it easier for corporations to make capital expenditures, to buy machinery and equipment and buildings. One little problem. Because we've had a sluggish economy, additional capacity has not been required, and therefore there hasn't been that much expenditure for manufacturing equipment. That's changing. Manufacturing equipment purchases have gone up in the past year, and when they have, the interest expenses to make those purchases have been affordable. But as we know, interest expenses are probably going to be pushed upwards because of this federal spending problem. That concludes our discussion of the economy. It's a very long part of this video. We'll finish up this video by looking at market trends. And the purpose of this part of the video is simply to give you some idea of the kind of evidence that you need to gather in order to do good corporate planning or a good strategic assessment if you're doing a case in my course. So you're going to have to still do a great deal more, but what you're going to get from the few remarks that remain in this video is some ideas about the kind of information you need to gather. Markets ultimately end up with people. What are markets? Well, you know, if you talk to an economist, you'll get a different answer than you'll get from me, I suspect. But markets essentially are the sources of demand. They're the community of buyers They're people, right? Even if it's machinery, if we're talking about an industrial market, a market for industrial goods, eventually, you know, the industrial goods producers have to sell them to producers of consumer goods, you know. So at the end of the day, we're talking about people. And if we look at this chart, we see long-term trends in various age groups. And what's important about these trends is that they're so different, number one. And number two, each of these age groups has different requirements. Let's just think about the requirements for a home. The 25 to 44-year-old group, they've recently entered the workforce. They're buying new homes. They have expanding families. They buy a particular kind of car. They love SUVs because you can throw more kids and more stuff from Walmart in them. But they have a set of needs and demands and preferences that are different from the older group, which you can see right next to the 25 to 44, that rising black line, 45 to 64. These are the folks in their peak earning years, aren't they? And their kids are out of school. They don't have to pay for them. They don't have to, if you'll pardon my sense of humor, they don't have to go down to the police station on the weekends and bail their kids out of jail. My students laugh at that. I don't know whether you will. Anyway, these folks are called empty nesters. And they have different they buy different kinds of houses. Maybe they're on golf courses. They're more likely to buy the more conservative but more expensive car. They're more likely to take vacations. They have different tastes in clothing and food, and they have greater needs for health care. And you can go through every one of these age groups on this chart, and each one of those age groups has different requirements, and I'm sure you'll agree to that. Really, what just knocks you out here is how fast the 25 to 44-year-old group grew in the 1970s and 80s, and then as they grew older, they became participants or members of the 45 to 64-year-old group, and that group size grew. So these age groups change as people get older. And people in the same cohort grow older, and the size of their age group, of an older age group, then takes on their proportions. Now, what's especially interesting is when we forecast the size of these age groups. And here's the forecast. Now, back here we saw the 45 to 64-year-old group as the fastest growing age group. Now, what do we see? The dotted lines, the red vertical dotted lines are identified today on the left side and 2030 on the right side. So essentially about 15 years. And in this next decade especially, what do we see in the 45 to 64-year-old group? Well, they're declining, whereas they that were the fastest growing group in the most recent couple of decades, they are now a declining group. These are new people. The people who were in the 45 to 64-year-old group, what group are they in now? They're in the seniors group, and you can see that the seniors group in the forecast for the next 15 years is growing like a rocket. By the way, the 25 to 44-year-old group also is growing, not as rapidly, but what it says is that we've got a growing workforce. There are some, and young adults, in fact, and this is good news and not good news. In order to have a healthy economy and avoid some of those welfare payments, we've got to employ those people. We've got growing numbers of people who are eligible to work. But do you remember the labor force participation rate? Only 2/3 of those people are employed, and another third of them is not, even though they could be employed. So a rising workforce has, it has its good sides and its bad sides. One side is they give us growth potential. The other side is we have to employ them, or they represent a growing burden on society. Here's a chart for that same thing, the growth of older people. And yes, indeed, it's been growing. Today, let's see, by 2010, it was already up to over 40 million people. Today, it's a great deal more than that. That's a lot of old people who need Social Security and get it. But our country isn't as burdened as other countries with senior citizens. Here's a chart that shows the trend for our country, some other countries, and groups of countries. And which group has the largest, or which country has the largest proportion of people over 65? And lo and behold, at about 22.5%, of its total population is Japan in 2015. By 2020, it'll be 27%. So today it's pushing a quarter of the whole population. Ours is about 20, theirs is about 25. So Japan has taken some rather interesting steps to accommodate its senior citizens. I won't go into it now, but it includes the use of robots and some real innovative techniques. What's the line just below it? Well, that's Eastern Europe. I'm sorry, it's Europe, the Eurozone. Today there are, I believe, 18 countries that use the euro as its currency. But when this chart was done, there were 15, and as you can see, folks in Europe who are over 65 represent a larger portion of the total population than in the United States, which is the dark dotted line. And which line is the comer? Which one is starting to grow faster? Lo and behold, it's South Korea. And that's because the Korean economy is growing, industrializing, developing, and as it does, people are living longer. So this phenomenon is occurring all over the world. Here's one that has some rather interesting ramifications. I won't get into it because you could have quite a conversation, but just these are the people 15 to 18 years old. Who are still living with their parents. Not a surprise that 2/3 of the young people 15 to 18 years old in this country still live with their parents. But if you go to Canada at the bottom of this chart, by the time they're 15 to 18, almost 70%, 69% are out on their own. Only 31% are still living with their parents. So there's a real cultural difference here. Among other things, young Canadian people are perhaps more independent than American people who are this age. You might say that. If you're in Italy, on the other hand, just about all people in that age group live with their parents. And we can see that there's a segment of Europe, all in the same general area, Italy, Greece, and Spain, where folks tend to live, younger folks who are approaching adulthood still live with their parents. But the dramatic difference between the United States and our neighbors in Canada is quite striking in this chart. And by the way, this also talks about differences between market segments, doesn't it? In Canada, these people, 15 to 18, who are on their own, they represent a separate market segment with unique needs and preferences and demands, much different from the young people who don't have to worry about buying cars and homes and paying insurance when they're living at home in the United States. That's a market segment too, but that market segment of people 15 to 18 in the United States is much different than the same age group in Canada, is it not? That's the importance here. That's the reason for showing this information. You've got to get this information before you can form a satisfactory marketing strategy. Okay, now we move to changes. We saw in these trends major changes in age groups, right? So those changes we often refer to as a demographic shift. And what's a demographic shift? Among other things, it's a major driver, as we've just seen, in of changes in markets and whole economies. So very often it's referred to as that people think of those population charts as a significant change in the size or proportion of an age group. But as we can see down below on this slide, there are lots of other reasons why population groups of people shift in their sizes or their locations. It could be that the people migrate, by way of example. Could be that because of economic development, the proportion of people in low, middle, and high income groups change over time. So the number of people who are going to college, ethnic groups, all these things are demographic shifts when their sizes change. Well, let's talk about geographic migration. Oops, pardon me, I've got to look at this slide first. Can we forecast demographic shifts accurately? And the answer is yes, if we're forecasting shifts in the population of large groups, for instance, an entire nation. We can forecast demographic shifts in age groups, for instance, in the United States and other developed countries where data have been collected from census taking. We have good information, and we can forecast the changes in population of age groups pretty well, because nearly everyone in the forecast already has been born and counted in a census. Who hasn't been born yet and counted in a census? Infants, right? So if there are 20 million people in the United States between 0 and 10 years old, 10 years from now, there will be 20 million people between 10 and 20 years old. How many people 10 years ago will be between 0 and 10 years old? We don't have those data, but we do have the ability to guess the fertility rate, that is the proportion, the number of children on average that a mother will have. And so by taking a look at the number of women who are of childbearing age, the average age that they have children, and the trend in the number of children they have, we can get pretty accurate in forecasting the population of very young people. But that's where we have to make some assumptions. So generally speaking, if we're talking about a whole nation, we can get very accurate in our population forecast. Now, what if we're talking about a more limited area, like a metropolitan area, the New York metropolitan area, or Houston or Los Angeles? Well, as you know, we have lots of immigration. We have lots of migration from one geographic area to another. In California, people are leaving the state, companies are leaving the state because the tax rates are so high. And so because of migration, immigration and emigration, as well as the emergence of new industries, it is very possible that errors will come in to our population forecast. still can be pretty accurate in those forecasts, but just not as accurate as when we're forecasting for a whole nation. The result is that we might say that our forecasts are moderately accurate. If we get an A for forecasting entire nations, maybe we get a B for forecasting more limited geographic regions or metropolitan markets. Now, if we're talking about groups that are just beginning to form, such as the number of graduates that have science, technology, engineering, and mathematics degrees, the STEM graduates, for instance, or other specifically defined cohorts of people who have common characteristics. And if they are emerging groups, then our ability to forecast their sizes becomes even less reliable. And we're not as good at that as we would like to be. And then finally, there are some groups that we just don't see. They're there, but they're really hard to identify. Records are not kept for them. And a perfect example is terrorists, right? Terrorists don't want to be recorded. They don't want to be noticed. Various gangs, you hear about them on the news. We have some data about them, but they migrate. They're migrating. There's one gang, a large gang, that's migrating all over the United States. We don't have good records on them, and it's very difficult to forecast how big the group is or where it's where it's located. And there we just don't have accurate forecasting at all. We use entirely different methods than population statistics to forecast those groups. We use metaphors. We use econometric modeling. We use scenarios to imagine where they might be for various reasons. And these methods are not very reliable. Now, we talked about geographic migration. Please take a look at this table and tell me what you see here. Where do you see any particular patterns of demographic shifts? You notice that there are two columns. People who are under 45 years old and people who are 45 or older. And by the way, these are all adults. So the under 45 probably starts at 18 years old. And we can see in the top group that between 2000 and 2010, the young adult groups in those 10 metropolitan markets grew quite rapidly. And by the way, you can see that the 10th fastest growing metropolitan market is here in this area, Raleigh, North Carolina area. For those of you who are watching this video in another geographic area, our university is very close to Raleigh. It's not quite a suburb, but it's almost. So you can see that in that top group, the young adult group, the young adult populations grew rapidly. In the bottom, we can see that the young adult group has been declining. It's been shrinking, hasn't grown at all. Instead, during that decade, you know, people, young adults emigrated away from those cities. What is the difference between the top group and the bottom group? By this time, you've probably figured out the top group is in the South and the West, and it's where industry is growing for a variety of reasons, but it's in the South and the West. Where do we find the metropolitan markets in the bottom? Youngstown, Ohio. I used to have a client there. It's awful. It's just barren. Used to be a manufacturing mecca. Great big steel company was there, and I worked in it, worked with it. And other manufacturers using the steel that came out of that mill would manufacture products from steel, and they're gone too. Right beneath it, Pittsburgh, the steel capital of the world. Down to number 4, Buffalo, then Cleveland, Syracuse, Rochester, Detroit. You've heard about what's happened at Detroit. So those are the old manufacturing centers. And we know from our earlier charts that manufacturing is a declining sector of the economy. And here's the impact on the metropolitan markets where those industries were located, and a population of young people who work and pay taxes. Now the right column are the folks who are 45 and older. And in the top, we've got a lower proportion of the population, lower growth rates than at the bottom. Why is that? Well, the folks 45 and older in the Sun Belt are already there, and more are moving in, but the proportion relative to the total population just is not as great, because there's so many more young people who are coming into the area to seek employment. On the other hand, what do we have in the I don't know what you'd call it, the Rust Belt maybe, and we see much higher proportions of population of over 45. Essentially, in those areas, if you're over 45, let's say you're 50 years old, you're looking forward to retirement, and you have a job. The job you've got is the job you want, and you don't want to go anywhere. And then you retire and you stay there. Some people make enough money to migrate to Florida, and you can see the number 7 in the growth area, Cape Coral, Florida. You've got a 52% growth in people over 45 years old. But generally speaking, the folks who retire in the Rust Belt stay there. The inflation is low there. The weather may not be as good, but the cost of living isn't as high, and they just sort of settle in while the young people are leaving, which plays hell with the tax base. And nevertheless, you can see that here we have essentially 4 major demographic shifts, 2 in each of these groups of metropolitan markets. Oh, by the way, just to make sure we're clear on this, is this relevant to strategic planners in business? And if you're a retailer, if your company is a retail chain, if you're McDonald's, if you're Wendy's, if you're Kmart, not Kmart, Walmart, if you're a department store chain, whatever the, if you're a manufacturer of automobiles and you want to get dealers started up, where are you going to try to grow? Where are you going to look for growth opportunities? Are you going to look for them in the Rust Belt? I don't think a whole lot of investment by retailers is going to occur in the Rust Belt. How about in the Sun Belt on the top group? Oh yeah, okay. So it's information like this that we use to plan for the growth of consumer markets, and particularly retailing. Okay, here's another trend that is having a major impact on markets in the United States and around the world. I dealt with it recently when I assisted a client that makes components for big buildings, industrial buildings, but more importantly, high-rise office buildings, apartment buildings, and condominiums. What you see in the top chart in the brown shaded area is the proportion, and this is these are changes between 1960 and 2010. 50-year changes, long-term changes, but these changes, these trends are still ongoing. The top brown bar or shaded area is the portion of the population that has never been married. In 1960, it was 15%. By 2010, that's 8 years ago, it was 28. It had almost doubled. By today, it's over 30. What portion was married? That's the dark green shaded area at the bottom, from 72% to 51%. And the others were divorced or separated or widowed. And by the way, the proportion of ladies who are widowed has almost tripled because they live longer than guys do. These have massive implications for companies that build residential buildings, whether they're single-family homes or much more important these days, especially in Canada, I might add, but in this country as well, multi-family buildings, high-rise apartment buildings, and condominiums. Another important trend is shown in the chart at the bottom, where you see the average age at which people get married. 1960, it was about 23 for guys and 20 for gals. By 2010, it was almost 29 for guys and 26 for gals. So, and those trends were ongoing. So, if those were the ages back in 2010, you can bet it's older now. This has a whole lot to say about the kind of homes that people buy when they do get married, about the kind of lifestyles that they have. And don't forget, many of those people both are employed, and so their median family income is way above $59,000. And so they are big spenders. Now, a little bit more about marriage. And again, I'm going to let you look at the details of these charts for more information. But just look at the top of the chart where we see the red circle. In 1960, 82% of young adults 25 to 34, just recently entering the workforce, 82% were married. By 2010, that number had halved down to 44%. That's a huge change. Let's just drop down to the lower left-hand corner. Again, you can look at all the other data on this chart, but there's a very consistent pattern here. And we're going to, and by the way, the firm that did this research, the Pew organization, is a highly regarded research organization that does very high quality work. And what we see is the results of questions that were asked of these various population groups. Is marriage becoming obsolete? And in the 18 to 29-year-old group, the group that was entering the workforce, just getting out of college, getting out of high school perhaps, and going to work, new entrants into the workforce, 44% said yes. 41% of those who were between 30 and 49 said yes. 41%, almost the same proportion as the younger group. So over 40% of people between 18 and 49, essentially the largest part of the workforce, thought that marriage was obsolete. The impacts of this on lifestyles, preferences, the way kids are raised, if kids are raised, if they're going to have kids, major changes that we have to take into account in consumer marketing. From everything from the kind of products we produce to the way we advertise them, the kind of scenarios that we put into advertisements on television. The impacts of these trends are just massive. Here's another trend that exists all over the world, and that is the growing proportion of people who are either overweight or obese. As you can see, by 2013, almost 20% of people in the world were obese, and over 40% were overweight. And as you can see, those trends have one very clear pattern. They're rising. So these trends ended in 2013. I just happened to find this report and thought it was so important that I copied its exhibit and show it to you. But these trends have continued onward. Does this have an impact for healthcare and the healthcare industry? Oh, yes, it does. Does it have an impact for consumer food and beverage manufacturers? If you're doing the PepsiCo case, you bet it does. Mrs. Nooyi, the chairman of PepsiCo, realized that this was such an important trend that PepsiCo has begun to make and advertise a whole category of products that are either better for you or really good for you, healthier foods and healthier beverages, and it's working. Now, here are the same trends for several countries. Where do you see these trends the most pronounced? Answer: the United States and Mexico. When I was at PepsiCo, I did some research just into the soft drink industry, and lo and behold, I found out that the highest per capita consumption of Coca-Cola, our arch rival, was in Mexico. Mexico had the highest proportion of carbonated soft drinks. You might say, well, golly, now that we have sugar-free beverages, we've solved that problem. And in fact, that's not true, because the sweet taste creates the habit of consuming sweet beverages and foods. And when kids get into that habit, then they eat and consume other foods and beverages that are fattening, and the rest is history. Again, if you're a retailer, you're kind of interested in distribution and which chains sell the most consumer products. And as you can see, grocery store chains, number one grocery store chain is Kroger. So if you're in consumer products retailing, food and beverage retailing, and you're not doing business with Kroger, you're not a major league player. And here's that item. I should actually put this one right after that obesity chart, shouldn't I? This is the trend. Maybe I'll do that right now so that when I discuss this in the future, it'll be in the right place. But you can see that the sugar-free beverages consumption has declined. Why? Because it's turned out that the chemical that makes sugar-free beverages sweet has some health and endangering characteristics that have encouraged people not to drink as much sugar-free beverages anymore. Instead, we have substitutes for carbonated beverages that are sweet in taste. What's the number one substitute? Bottled water, right? Okay. I think we're getting near the end of this market trend segment for those of you who are concerned. But here's the trend in the agriculture market and the number of acres that have been planted over many years since the mid-1970s. As you can see, the number of acres have really gone down. Essentially, they've been paved over, haven't they? The good news is that it looks like in recent years, that trend has started to turn back up. That's a good thing for the agriculture industry, and it's a good thing for all those people who don't have enough food in countries that import agricultural product from the United States. Out of about 7.5 billion people in the world, almost 1 billion don't have enough to eat. They're either starving or famished. As nations develop, the incomes of people grow, their standards of living go up, and what do they want when their standards of living go up? More meat. So now we need even more grain to feed the cows, as well as, and the sheep and the goats, as well as to feed the people. So we need more agricultural productivity. As you can see, this chart with its green coloring and yellow coloring was taken from the Deere and Company fact book, where I believe, I'm not sure whether this came from the fact book or whether we created it here, but you can see that there's a rather dramatic shift in the number of farms that's going down, whereas the average farm size is going up. Another demographic shift, all right? And what this says to companies like Deere is that you've got to be prepared to deal with larger customers. These are turning into agribusinesses, and they have the ability to negotiate price because they can buy this big equipment sold by Deere, but they want more for their money. Now, this same trend exists in China, but at a much lower level. In China, historically, since the revolution, since Chairman Mao, since the new Chinese government was installed with Mao Zedong, the individuals had the right to use plots of land, and these plots of land were small. The government actually owns the land, but people have today rights to little plots of land. And with recent legislation in China, people now have the right to sell those rights to the land. So they don't sell the land, but it's the same as selling the land because they sell the right to the land. And what's been happening recently is that people are moving from the country to the city in China, and they're selling the right to their plot of land to small companies that are forming larger farms. And so over time, what's going to happen in China is there will be more larger farms, but fewer of them. And eventually, they'll get large enough to use large farm equipment like Deere makes. Right now, the average farm size in China is a lot smaller than the average farm size in the United States. So not as much opportunity to use big equipment, but that's clearly the growth market for agricultural equipment. Okay, here's the trend in fuel prices, gasoline, diesel fuel, and although it's not on this chart, jet fuel behaves the same way. And as you can see, those prices were going up rather rapidly. I think we saw them in an earlier chart. Then they came down with fracking, then they came up, then they came back down again. Now they're rising again. But depending on how this trend evolves, the demand for jet engines, diesel engines, and auto engines that are more economical users of fuel, that demand will go up, even to the extent where the demand is for automotive engines that don't have internal combustion engines, but rather batteries and fuel cells. Here's a chart that amplifies what I said earlier about China. These lines represent the number of cars purchased in China, the US, Germany, and Japan. And as you can see, the largest market by far, and this graph goes through 2016, is China, where some 24.5, almost 25 million cars were purchased. I might add that auto production is equally large in China. And these are cars that don't include light trucks. So the numbers are even lower than you would expect for the US. But less than 7 million cars sold in the US. No doubt about it, the growth market for cars in the world is China. As China's economy grows, as standards of living grow, as more families have more income, there's going to be greater demand for cars. The auto industry is a growth market in China. It's not a growth market in the United States. So if you're in the auto industry and you're not doing business full tilt in China, you're just not a major player. And so all of them are. I might add that when I was in China about a year ago, I was amazed to see barges full of cars coming down the Yangtze River. Those cars were manufactured by companies that we've never heard of here. Those cars were not made in Japan. They weren't made by manufacturers that are headquartered in the United States, but they were made by Chinese auto manufacturers who don't sell cars in the US. But one day they probably will, because if we don't let their cars into this country, maybe they won't let our cars into their country. And as you can see from this chart, that would be a catastrophe for our auto industry. Another thing that you really need to do when you're doing an analysis of a company is to take in a company's market is to be sure that you get good information about market shares. It tells you where your company stands relative to others. It tells you who the leaders and the followers are. It's very often the beginning point for forming marketing strategy. But here, by the way, is another trend. And again, I probably should push this chart up above the market share chart. But this is the trend in air travel. And what you can see, and by the way, this is air travel to and from the United States only. So these are the routes to Europe, to South America, to Asia, and to Canada. You can't see the Asian one very much. It's made up of gray bars, but and Asia, the Asian routes are growing. But where are the biggest routes from the U.S. to foreign countries? And in recent years, the growth has been in travel to South America and the Caribbean, Latin America. Why is that? Well, it's because we have more immigrants from those countries, and once they get here, they want to go home. And of course, we're doing more business with those countries. And so, whereas in the past, the busiest routes were over the Atlantic to Europe, now it's South America or Latin America. This ends part one of and I'm sure you're ready for a break, but this ends part one of our review of gathering evidence. In part two, we'll begin, as this slide indicates, with industry analysis. Then we'll take a look at gathering evidence on internal capabilities and rationalizing evidence gathered about the external environment to evidence gathered about internal capabilities. But for right now, I hope you have benefited from this little review of the external environment and particularly the economies and market variables that can influence your firm's performance potential. Take a break, and when you're ready, join me for part two, where we'll finish up our review of gathering evidence to make strategic decisions. And with that, I am going to try to stop this recording and say goodbye to you. Goodbye. Goodbye.